Welcome to our tutorial about setting up your MIDI hardware. In this tutorial, we'll be talking about how to make connections between your MIDI equipment and your computer. First, be sure to make sure your connections are made with all of your equipment turned off. In order to create or play a MIDI recording, you must have a MIDI sound module. This can be an external piece of hardware like a keyboard. It needs to be connected to the computer through a MIDI interface. Most professional audio interfaces these days also include the necessary MIDI connections, but make sure to check before you buy. MIDI ports and cables have 5 connectors, and they look something like this. We cover how each of these ports work in our general course on mixing, mastering, and digital recording. But for the time being, just keep it in mind that if you've got a cable with 5 pins or a connection with 5 holes, is for MIDI. MIDI equipment usually has 3 ports, as you see here. The MIDI in port, the MIDI out port, and the MIDI through port. The MIDI in port brings data in from somewhere else, like from your keyboard into your sound card. This is how you record MIDI, transferring it from your keyboard or controller into Cubase. The in port lets your keyboard control your sound card. So you plug a MIDI cable from the out port on your keyboard to the in port of your sound card. The MIDI out port allows your sound card to be the controller, like from your sound card back to your piano. This is how you play back recorded MIDI data through your external instrument. What you do here is plug a MIDI cable from your sound card's MIDI out port to your keyboard's MIDI in port. The MIDI through port sends a copy of the data received at the MIDI in port to another MIDI device in a MIDI chain. It doesn't control anything, it's just a connector. You'd use this to connect, for example, another MIDI sound back to your keyboard. You won't hear anything while you play or record MIDI unless you connect your keyboard to an external monitor or route it through your audio hardware interface or set up a virtual instrument. That's because MIDI is not sound, it's data. Let's take a moment to consider what a typical MIDI setup might look like. You can use multiple sound sources, and if that's the case, it's a good idea to use an interface with more than one output or a separate MIDI through box instead of the through jacks on each unit. On a Macintosh, you need to configure the Audio MIDI Setup utility that comes with the OS X operating system. It's in your Applications Utilities folder. Or you can get to it from SetUp, Edit MIDI Studio. That's inside Cubase. First, click the MIDI Devices tab. The AMS utility scans your system for connected MIDI interfaces. If your interface is properly connected, it'll appear in this window with each of its ports showing in and out arrows where you can make connections. If you don't see your MIDI interface, you might need to check the interface instructions. A driver reinstall or a simple reboot might be necessary. Be sure to make the connections with your power off. Let's say I want to add my keyboard, a Korg Triton. We click Add Device. The new external device icon appears. Now connect the new device to your MIDI interface. Just click the arrow on the output and cable it over to the input arrow. The next step is to connect the output port of the MIDI interface back to the input on the synth. Now let's double-click the new device to open its properties. We select a manufacturer and model, but if nothing seems to match, just type in the name of your synth. Let's enable the channels for sending and receiving MIDI data, otherwise no data will get from our external instrument back to our sound card. You can choose 1 channel for transmitting and up to 16 for receiving. When you're finished, click Apply. Now my Triton will be available as an input or output selection on MIDI tracks. MIDI is an exciting tool that puts the musical universe at the home studio musician's fingertips. For more information on MIDI, please see our tutorials later in this course and in our general course on music recording, mixing, and mastering. And this concludes our tutorial about how to set up your MIDI hardware for recording.